a brilliant engineer and his teenage daughter, boarded a test flight over the Rockies and were never seen again. No wreckage, no signal, no answers. Authorities ruled it a tragic accident, but 11 years later, a hidden bunker beneath a crumbling horse stable would reveal a horrifying secret, one that would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about their disappearance. The wind was sharp that morning, unusually so for early June in Colorado. David Greer stood beside the massive, half-inflated balloon fabric, his hands wrapped around a steaming thermos, the edges of his breath curling visibly into the crisp air. "You sure about this, Dad?" came Ivy's voice, slightly muffled beneath her oversized hoodie. She was 13 and tall for her age, with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak that David always said reminded him of her mother. He turned to face her, offering a reassuring smile. "You nervous?" "No," she lied. David stepped closer, placing the thermos on the ground. He crouched to her level. "Listen, I know it's a test flight, but we've done this 100 times. Today's just one more." Ivy didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted to the colorful balloon canopy, laid out like a giant sleeping creature waiting to breathe. "You promised we'd be back before lunch," she finally said. "We will. Just a short loop around Ravenswood and down near Lake Corcoran, 2 hours tops." She nodded, though he could tell she wasn't convinced. David gave her shoulder a squeeze and stood. The burner hissed to life moments later, filling the air with rhythmic bursts of flame. The balloon began to rise, slow and deliberate, as the ground crew, 2 of David's employees, moved with rehearsed precision. They were up in less than 20 minutes. The basket creaked gently beneath their feet as the balloon swayed with the breeze. Ivy gripped the edge and peeked over. Below them, the tree line faded into mist, and Ravenswood Highlands sprawled out like a patchwork quilt in shades of green and gray. "Still think it's boring?" David teased. Ivy rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Maybe just a little less boring." At 6:42 a.m., they cleared the upper ridge, a spot known as Ridge Point Crest. The GPS on David's panel blinked its position steadily. Everything was going according to plan. Ivy pointed to a streak of shadow across the valley. "Is that where the lake is?" "Yep, we'll circle that edge, then ride the wind back, down the slope." The sun, now fully emerged, cast their shadows long across the canopy, gilding the clouds beneath them. It was beautiful, serene, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, just past 7:10 a.m., the first anomaly hit. A slight jolt, a lurch not typical for that altitude. David's hand instinctively went to the burner controls. Ivy stumbled slightly. What was that? Probably just wind shear. "Hold on." He adjusted altitude, pulling the lever to gain height, but the balloon didn't respond. In fact, it dropped slightly. Frowning, David checked the controls again. "That's not right." His brow furrowed as he examined the gauge. The propane flow was uneven. One of the nozzles read colder than expected. He checked the backup system. Still no lift. "Is something wrong?" Ivy's voice had lost its playful edge. David hesitated. "Might be a clog, or a leak. Not dangerous, just..." The balloon jolted again, harder. David grabbed the radio, but there was only static. "This is Test Vessel Alpha 9 requesting assistance. Possible control issue. Over." Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. They were now descending, slow but noticeable. "Dad, the trees," Ivy pointed. The slope below them rose sharply, and the edge of the tree line was now far closer than it should have been. David began shifting weight, releasing ballast manually. The basket lightened slightly, slowing their descent, but not stopping it. He spotted a clearing about 200 yards ahead, just enough space to attempt an emergency landing. "Ivy, hold on to the side. Tuck your head and brace." "Is it bad?" "We'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure. The balloon scraped treetops. Branches snapped. David yelled as a sudden crosswind hit them sideways, pushing the balloon off course. They missed the clearing by 15 feet. The basket struck the slope hard, flipping once. Ivy screamed. David held her tight as they rolled. Then, nothing. The world went black. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried overhead, its wings catching the light just above the broken trees. By the time the ground crew realized the balloon had deviated from its path, it was already too late. The last ping from the onboard GPS came at 7:14 a.m., coordinates just outside the approved flight corridor. Search crews were dispatched within hours, drones, helicopters, ranger units, but there was no wreckage, no signal, no balloon. As if father and daughter had disappeared into mist. The incident was recorded as a vanishing in transit, and for 10 long years the file gathered dust at the edge of belief and folklore. But deep in the woods, wrapped in silence and shadow, the truth waited. For the first few weeks, the forest echoed with human voices, radio chatter, and the thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the summer air. Rangers from the State Search and Rescue Unit, volunteers with orange vests, canine units, even private drone operators joined the last known coordinates, was scoured. The clearing David had aimed for was located, but it showed no signs of impact. No broken branches, no burned grass, no fragments of wicker or nylon. It was as if the balloon had simply evaporated. In the early days, media outlets swarmed the area. "Engineer and daughter vanish in test flight," read one headline. "Skynova co-founder missing over Colorado wilderness," read another. But headlines faded fast, and by the time fall painted the highlands in hues of amber and rust, only the most stubborn searchers remained. Hannah Greer, David's ex-wife and Ivy's mother, led vigils by the lake every weekend. She clung to every theory, every unconfirmed sighting. A grainy photo from a hiker in Montana sparked temporary hope. A discarded shoe found near a ravine sent teams scrambling again. But nothing held. The shoe wasn't Ivy's. The photo was of an unrelated balloon ride. 14 months after the incident, with no new evidence and dwindling resources, the official status changed. The case was downgraded to inactive, marked as a probable crash with no survivors. The term used by the state report was presumed fatal disappearance due to mechanical failure. A plaque was placed at Ridgepoint Crest, near the balloon's last known signal, commemorating the lives of David and Ivy Greer. But not everyone was ready to move on. Not Hannah, not Clara Brooks, who had grown up idolizing her cousin Ivy, and certainly not Elliot Frayne. At first, Elliot mourned publicly. He spoke at the press conference after the downgrade. "David wasn't just a partner," he said, voice trembling. "He was a friend, a brother." But behind the scenes, something else had begun taking shape. Within weeks of the status change, Elliot filed legal documents presenting a handwritten letter dated 2 days before the flight, signed by David Greer. The letter, notarized by a third-party lawyer in Aspen, stated that in the event of an accident or incapacity, all operational control and executive authority of Skynova Ventures would transfer to Elliot Frayne. The document shocked everyone, particularly Hannah, who claimed David never discussed such a contingency, let alone in writing. But the signature matched previous legal records, and the notary confirmed its validity. With David officially presumed dead, Elliot's claim stood. He took full control of the company, now valued at over $18 million, 0 cents thanks to its expanding contracts with adventure tourism providers and defense altitude tech. In public, he was modest. "I'm just carrying David's legacy forward," he told reporters. "Skynova is his dream, I'm just here to protect it." But internally, the structure of the company shifted fast. Research departments were consolidated, longtime engineers were laid off, new patent applications emerged, several of which were based on ideas David had never shared with anyone but Ivy and presumably Elliot. Hannah challenged the transfer, but the court ruled in favor of Frayne. The notary's deposition, the dated document, and the lack of any contradiction from the deceased's legal will closed the case. By 2016, the story of David and Ivy Greer was relegated to cold case blogs and conspiracy threads. Some believed the balloon crash had been staged, that David faked his death and took Ivy abroad. Others claimed government cover-ups, alien abductions, or secret aerospace experiments gone wrong. None of them had evidence. Clara, meanwhile, grew increasingly obsessed. Though she was just 17 when Ivy vanished, she'd always felt something was off. David had been careful, meticulous. He would never fly without full system checks. Ivy, despite her age, was smart and aware. Clara remembered the hours they'd spent talking about Ivy's dream to one day design eco-friendly airships for oceanic climate studies. She wouldn't vanish without a trace, not voluntarily. By the time Clara finished her mechanical engineering degree in 2022, she had assembled a personal archive of every piece of data related to the incident. Weather patterns from that day, flight logs, terrain maps, and even radio recording. She had reached out to Skynova for additional telemetry data, but was told those files were confidential and no longer available. Elliott had restructured their archival system, and older non-military flight records were purged for storage optimization. Around the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, Clara returned to Colorado. It had become an annual ritual, one Hannah quietly supported. The air at Ridgepoint felt different now, less sorrowful, more expectant. Clara stood at the overlook and traced the ridgeline with her binoculars. That's when she noticed it, a tree near the edge of a sharp drop, far from the main trail. A tear in the bark, something caught in a branch. It shimmered. Fabric, possibly synthetic, purple, reflective, oddly familiar. Her heart stuttered in her chest as she stepped off the trail and pushed through underbrush toward it, each footfall crushing fallen pine needles, every branch whispering secrets of the past. The wind picked up again, colder now, and from somewhere deep in the forest came the distant sound of leaves moving against metal. Clara Brooks stood frozen, one foot on the rocky incline, her gloved hand still outstretched where she had brushed past the pine limb. The fabric, torn, faded but undeniably artificial, flapped slightly in the breeze like a forgotten flag. She narrowed her eyes and leaned in, careful not to disturb it further. The material shivered faintly, a purple-silver blend with a strange geometric pattern partially visible along one edge. It looked familiar, not just in texture or sheen, but in design. Clara's breath caught as a memory surfaced, vivid despite the decade that had passed. Ivy sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, tracing triangles on graph paper, while her father looked on, adjusting sketches of balloon canopies on his tablet. David had always let Ivy lead the design, encouraging her creativity even in technical context. "We'll make it look like a storm cloud at sunrise," she had said once, pointing to a color sketch, muted purple, deep gray, a line of orange. "Because storms look scary, but they mean something new is coming." Clara had laughed then, calling her poetic. But now, in this high, quiet ridge of Ravenswood, where hikers rarely ventured, she was staring at fabric that bore the exact same triangular pattern Ivy had drawn 10 years ago. Her heart pounded, both from exertion and something deeper, recognition laced with fear. She pulled out her phone and snapped multiple photos, adjusting the angle to capture the design clearly. Then, carefully, she used a small pocket knife to cut the fabric free where it had tangled. The edges were frayed, some threads blackened, as if by heat or time. Back at camp, she laid it across her gear mat, smoothing the piece with trembling hands. It wasn't just the color, there was a faint line of stitching across one corner, a kind of tag. Hand-sewn, slightly off-center, but legible. I agree, age 13. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat by her fire, watching the flames curl and twist like questions without answers. She scrolled through archived images on her phone, pictures she'd saved over the years. Ivy at the science fair, David at the launch pad with his arm around his daughter, Skynova promotional shots showing balloons with clean, elegant panels. But none of them used this exact color scheme, except one. A photo buried in the comments of a forgotten blog post. It showed the prototype canopy Ivy had designed just weeks before the final flight, with a caption David had typed himself. Custom paneling by our youngest team member, David Flight, June 2013. Claire zoomed in. The shape of the pattern, the way the cast formed a cascading effect. It matched. The fabric she found wasn't just from any balloon, it was from that balloon, and she knew exactly who could confirm it. The next morning, Clara drove 4 hours east to the edge of a dying town called Halden Creek, where her grandfather, Raymond Brooks, lived in a small trailer nestled behind an abandoned lumber yard. Ray had been Skynova's ground mechanic during its early years, long retired now, half-aff and bitter, but still sharp as a tack when it came to balloon mechanics. Claire hadn't visited him in over a year, but when she showed him the fabric, he didn't even blink before saying, "That's "You're sure?" she asked, barely breathing. Nobody stitched like he did, sloppy hands, always sewing at a curve. That ID marking, IG-13, that was Ivy's. He used it any time he let her modify something. Clara felt something inside her shift, an old suspicion turning into something closer to belief. She told Ray where she had found it, what ridge, what altitude, the state of the trees. He listened silently, then leaned back in his chair and muttered, "That balloon never went down where they said it did." "What do you mean?" "I told Elliot they were off by a mile, maybe more. That whole trajectory didn't make sense. But he shut the team down after the third week, said it was a waste of—" "He said this before? I gave her copies, but no one followed up. Too much red tape, and Frayne had already taken over by then." Clara stared at him. "Wait, you mean Elliot cut off the search effort?" "He redirected the drone mapping away from that quadrant, said the data was inconclusive. Thing is, the winds that morning would have pushed them exactly toward that ridge where you found the fabric." The pieces started clicking in Clara's mind. The altered search pattern, the early shutdown, it all felt manufactured. "Ray, do you still have your flight trajectory records?" He nodded slowly, reaching under his chair to pull out an old hard case binder. The plastic buckles cracked as he opened it, revealing pages of grid charts, altitude forecasts, and printouts marked in faded ink. Clara studied them for hours that night, aligning the projected drift path with GPS data and wind speed archives from 2013. The route David and Ivy had likely taken pointed almost directly toward the ridge where she found the fabric. If that piece had survived weather, wind, and time, it meant something else had too. A wreckage, maybe, a logbook, a trace. But more than that, it meant someone had missed or hidden something. And Clara was no longer willing to accept that David and Ivy were just gone. They had been lost, yes, but not without a trail. She now held the first thread in her hand. She packed her bag the next morning, retraced her route back to the ridge, and scanned the area where the fabric had hung. This time she moved slower, noting details she had missed before. A groove in the soil, faint but linear. A piece of metal embedded under a fallen branch. And not far from the first tree, half buried beneath earth and moss, what looked like part of a fuel line. Clara's hand shook slightly as she passed the sealed evidence bag to the private forensics center in Denver. The technician, a woman in her mid-40s with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm, professional air, took the fabric sample without comment, logging the chain of custody and sliding the package into a labeled intake container. Clara had specifically chosen this lab for their discretion and history of working on private investigations, often handling evidence that law enforcement declined to process. She didn't want to go through official channels, not yet, not without proof that something more sinister had happened than just an accident. It took 4 days for the results to come back, and when Clara opened the report, sitting alone in a cafe off Colfax Avenue, her breath caught in her throat. Human blood. Trace elements found in the fabric, degraded by weather exposure but still chemically identifiable. The sample, the report explained, was consistent with being several years old and matched typical clotting patterns associated with blunt trauma. Claire stared at the words for a long time. This wasn't just a torn piece of balloon fabric. It was part of a scene of impact or struggle or something far worse. She glanced again at the map she had pinned on her laptop screen, marked with overlays of the original flight plan, wind simulations, and her GPS location at the time of the discovery. The spot she had found the fabric was a full 41.3 kilometers west of the official search grid, mapped out in 2013. That discrepancy couldn't be explained away by random drift or sudden gusts alone. The balloon must have veered dramatically, unnaturally, from its course, which begged the question, why? And who benefited from ignoring it? She emailed the report to Hannah that evening. The reply came the next morning. "Come over, we need to talk." She poured them both tea before sitting down heavily across from her. "I knew," she said after a long silence, "not about the fabric, but something wasn't right from the start. David was methodical, obsessed with safety. He would never fly that balloon without redundancy systems intact." Clara nodded. "I think someone tampered with it," Hannah said without hesitation. "You think so too?" "I don't just think it," Clara replied. "I'm going to prove it." They spent the next few hours going over everything Hannah had saved. Emails, David's backup hard drives, even handwritten notes and sketches Ivy had drawn and mailed during her early Skynova visits. Among the documents was a maintenance log showing the flight calibration for June 10, 2013, the day before the flight. Clara noticed something odd. The heading data was different than the last public telemetry update on file with the FAA. She zoomed in. "This doesn't match," she murmured. "The autopilot vector was changed." Hannah blinked. "Can that be done without David noticing?" "Only if someone accessed the control module remotely or inserted a new startup sequence without his knowledge." That night, Clara reached out to an old contact from her university days, someone who had interned at Skynova years ago. His name was Aaron Mahoney, and he had worked under Elliot during the company's early expansion. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Clara explained what she had found, he agreed to meet. They sat across from each other at a booth in a diner just outside Boulder, their conversation low and tense. "You're not wrong," Aaron said finally after she finished explaining. "Frayne had us swap out the nav chip in David's balloon 2 weeks before the incident, said it was a performance upgrade." "Did David approve it?" "No," Aaron said, his voice tight. No. Elliot ran the order through as a routine software update. But the chip, it was different. It used a proprietary routing protocol, completely untested. Why would Elliot do that? Because David wanted to delay the demo flight, said he wasn't comfortable with the altitude performance during wind shear. He was planning to pull out of the festival showcase. Elliot couldn't let that happen. He'd already locked in a military observer for the event. Big funding. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. So he sabotaged the demo? "I don't know if he meant for anything to go wrong," Aaron admitted, "but he sure as hell didn't care if it did." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "Not unless I have to," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, I've got a family now, but I'll give you the name of someone else, Dale Henriksen. He was Elliot's tech lead back then. If anyone knew what that chip was really for, it'd be him." Claire scribbled the name down and thanked him. Later that night, she searched for Dale online and found that he had relocated to Spokane, Washington, working under a new startup in autonomous air traffic systems. She sent him a research inquiry into legacy flight control modules. Meanwhile, she made copies of every document she and Hannah had compiled, stored them on encrypted drives, and began drafting a formal timeline of events. The evidence was mounting: a tampered flight system, a rerouted path, blood on a prototype fabric, and a co-finger who had stood to gain everything from David's disappearance. Clara wasn't ready to confront Elliot directly, not yet, but she needed to know how far this went. Next day, she contacted a freelance journalist she trusted, someone who had covered Skynova during its early days. She offered him a portion of the story, anonymously, just enough to stir the waters. Within 48 hours, a brief segment aired on a regional station. New questions arise in cold case of Skynova co-founders' disappearances. The footage showed the ridge where Clara had found the fabric, with blurred overlatches of the pattern. Elliot Frayne declined to comment. His assistant issued a short statement. Mr. Frayne has no new information and continues to respect the privacy of the Greer family. But Clara noticed something else. That same day, the company website quietly removed all legacy documentation of the 2013 prototype fleet. And when she tried to access old employee directories, the links were dead. Someone was cleaning house. She was running out of time. Clara returned to Hannah's home the morning after the broadcast, her hands clutching a new set of documents and her thoughts still reeling from the web of tampered systems, bloodied fabric, and a trail nearly scrubbed clean by the man once considered David's closest ally. Hannah opened the door before Clara even knocked, her eyes tired but alert, as though she too had slept with questions pacing the halls of her mind. They sat at the dining table, a space cluttered with unopened mail, mugs stained with tea, and photos, old ones, of Ivy taped to a corkboard beside the window. Clara didn't waste time. "I need to know if David ever mentioned installing any kind of personal tracker on Ivy," she asked quietly. Hannah blinked, then slowly nodded. "Had this little black thing, like a dog tag. Said it was a GPS beacon, just in case Ivy ever got separated from the team. He clipped it to the inner lining of her pack the week of the flight. I never even touched it after that. Do you still have the back?" Hannah hesitated, then stood and disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she carried a dusty cardboard box with masking tape across the top. Inside was the backpack, faded navy blue with a reflective stripe, the zippers slightly rusted from time. Clara opened the front pocket and fished around until her fingers touched cool metal. She pulled out a thumb-sized device, rectangular, with a small USB port and a serial number etched into one edge. "It's an early model," she murmured. "Low frequency, probably logs in bursts. If this thing still has memory, we might be able to trace where she went." They drove to a computer repair shop that specialized in outdated devices, and after an hour of tinkering, adapting old cable formats, and rebooting diagnostic software, the technician, an older man with thick glasses and a quiet voice, called them over. "You're lucky," he said. "Most of these only retain data for a few months, but looks like this one's got embedded flash. Somebody knew what they were doing." On the screen, a map of the Ravenswood region flickered to life. The data began at 6:44 a.m. on June 11, 2013, moments after the last GPS ping from the balloon. The first few coordinates matched the area Claire had already explored, the ridge where she'd found the fabric, but then the dots continued. At 9:12 a.m., the beacon had shifted southeast, toward a narrow canyon lined with unstable cliffs. By noon, it had moved further east, skirting the edge of a no-access wildlife zone known for its treacherous terrain. The signal continued to update until 10:41 p.m. on June 12, almost 48 hours post. The last logged position was just outside an industrial clearing, government mapped as Zone 5A, an area long since closed due to environmental degradation and landslide risks. The technician clicked through to the elevation logs. "Whoever was carrying this was walking, not riding," he said. "Small staggered increments, mostly downhill. They were on foot." Hannah stared at the map, her hands trembling. She was alive. "My daughter was alive." Clara put a hand on hers. "And she was trying to get out." They exported the coordinates and marked the final known position on multiple topographic maps. The zone, labeled only in survey codes, showed no formal trails, no structures, no roads. But Clara remembered something from the aerial scans she had reviewed weeks ago. Deep in that area, there had once been a fire service outpost, decommissioned and abandoned after a rockslide in 2007. She dug into archived land records and discovered a permit for a metal structure erected at the edge of the boundary, a storage warehouse meant to hold forestry tools and emergency rations. The listing showed it had been slated for demolition in 2011, but the report was never signed off. "What if she made it there?" Clara said aloud, more to herself than anyone. "What if that's where she stopped?" Hannah's eyes were distant now, haunted. "I remember the week before the flight," she whispered. "David said he felt uneasy, not about the weather, but about pressure from investors. He said Elliot was pushing the launch too fast, that things weren't ready, and he couldn't say no without risking everything they'd built. I thought he was just stressed. Now—" She trailed off. Clara stood. "I need to go there, that warehouse." "I'm coming with you," Hannah said firmly. Clara didn't argue. They packed their gear, including satellite GPS, climbing equipment, and a portable radio. Before leaving, Clara uploaded the full tracking data to multiple cloud drives and sent copies to 2 friends in case something went wrong. The terrain leading into Zone 5A was rougher than expected. Dense undergrowth clawed at their pants, and fallen trees turned each kilometer into a maze. But slowly, steadily, the land began to shift. The air grew damper, the ground darker with years of undisturbed mulch. Around noon on the second day, Clara spotted something through the trees, a faded orange flag flapping against a wooden stake. They paused, scanned the perimeter, and saw it. A corrugated steel building tucked into the hill, its outer wall streaked with rust and moss. It looked deserted, almost caved in on one side, but then Hannah pointed. There, above the door. Clara squinted. Etched into the metal frame, nearly hidden by grime, were initials scratched in small, shaky lines. I. Ivy Greer. The steel door resisted their first attempt to open it, the hinges rusted and swollen with years of neglect. But Clara wedged her crowbar into the side and pushed with her full weight until the metal groaned and gave way. A rush of stale air, tinged with mold and something faintly metallic, rolled out from the dark interior. They stood at the threshold, flashlights cutting through the dust, revealing rows of old crates and toppled shelving. The warehouse was silent, except for the steady creak of the wind through warped panels and the occasional shuffle of rodents escaping the intrusion. Hannah took a tentative step forward, her beam sweeping across the floor. It was cluttered with debris, tools, buckets, broken wood, but nothing initially jumped out as useful. Clara moved along the left wall, her fingers grazing over boxes marked with faded stencils. Maintenance guards and cities. Then, near the back, behind a leaning cabinet, she saw it. Something shiny wedged between planks of splintered wood. She reached down and retrieved it. A keychain, metal, oval-shaped with flaking blue paint. She turned it over and froze, engraved in small script, Ivy Greer. "Hannah," she called, her voice barely a whisper. Hannah hurried over, and when she saw the object in Clara's palm, her knees buckled slightly. She reached out, as if afraid it might vanish, her fingers trembling slightly. This was hers. David had it made the day she won the junior science fair. It was on her bag the morning they left. They stared at the keychain for a long time, the weight of it heavier than its size could suggest. Then Hannah noticed something else, just beside the cabinet, smeared against the baseboard. A faint reddish-brown stain. Clara knelt, pulling a sterile swab from her kit, and took a sample. It had dried long ago, crusted into the grain of the wood, but it was unmistakable. Blood. A few feet away, under a fallen plank, lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Hannah opened it slowly, her breath catching as the childlike handwriting came into view. It read, "Mom, I miss you. I don't know if you're coming. It's cold. I'm scared." Can fell into silence, pierced only by the crackle of the paper in Hannah's shaking hands. "She was here," she whispered. "My baby was here." Clara swallowed hard and pulled out her phone, snapping photos of everything, the keychain, the letter, the bloodstain, the immediate surroundings. Then she activated the emergency satellite beacon she had packed, transmitting coordinates and a priority alert to local law enforcement. The sheriff's department arrived 4 hours later, accompanied by 2 crime scene investigators and a cadaver dog team. They sealed the warehouse, set up perimeter lighting, and began cataloging every item inside. As Hannah gave her statement under a heat lamp near the cruisers, Clara watched the lead detective, a tall man named Jennings, examining the evidence with grim focus. "This note," he said after reading it, "was likely written within a day or two of her disappearance. The pen ink hasn't fully broken down, which means it's recent compared to the age of the paper stock. She survived the crash, and she got here on foot." "Then what happened?" Clara asked. "If she made it here, why wasn't she found?" Jennings shook his head. "That's what we're going to figure out." They searched the premises for more clues, but found no fresh signs of activity. No bones, no footprints, no DNA besides the bloodstain. It was as though Ivy had been here, left her plea, and vanished again. Claire stayed behind with one of the forensic techs, reviewing the surrounding structure for hidden compartments or evidence of makeshift shelter. They didn't find a bedroll or food wrappers, but there were scuff marks in the concrete near a drain vent, suggesting someone had either tried to leave or had been dragged. That possibility chilled Clara more than the cold. Over the next week, as news of the discovery spread, journalists swarmed the Highlands region again, headlines now reading, "New clues emerge in decade-old disappearances. Warehouse discovery reopens at remote site." Clara declined interviews, but she followed up with Detective Jennings every day. Meanwhile, she dug deeper into Skynova's corporate transitions after David's disappearances. Using public records, financial disclosures, and leaked investor presentations, she found something unsettling. 4 months after David's official status was changed to presumed deceased, Elliot Frayne filed an international patent on an altitude compensation algorithm, the very system David had been developing before the crash. Clara cross-corrected this with export documents and found that Frayne had negotiated a private sale with an aerospace conglomeration based in Eastern Europe worth over $12,700,000, 0 cent. The transfer occurred quietly, with no press release and no mention of David's involvement in the foundational technology. When Clara contacted the company for comment, they refused to respond. But a former Skynova intern, now working in a mid-level position there, sent Clara an encrypted message. They bought the tech under the condition all legacy rights were cleared. Elliot claimed full authorship, The documents state David had no living heirs or claims pending. Clara forwarded this message to Detective Jennings. Within 2 days, he obtained a subpoena for Skynova's internal communications during the month leading up to the crash. What they uncovered confirmed Clara's worst suspicions. Elliot had emailed legal counsel 2 weeks before the incident, asking them to prepare transition documents contingent upon David's withdrawal from active duties. Attached to the email was a draft of the notarized transfer letter, a full 11 days before the signature date. Jennings stared at the printout and muttered, he knew. He was preparing for David to disappear, but what no one could yet explain was how Ivy had survived the crash, left messages, bled inside a locked building, and then vanished without further trace. Claire stood outside the warehouse that evening, watching the forensic teams pack up their gear. Hannah sat inside a cruiser, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind had picked up again, and in the fading light, Clara noticed something glinting near the rear corner of the building, a narrow gap beneath the foundation, partially hidden by overgrowth. She crouched and pulled back the weeds. A cold rush of air wafted out. It wasn't just a storage facility, there was something beneath it, a crawlspace, or maybe something deeper. She called for Jennings. Within minutes, a team was digging through the entrance with shovels and headlamps, uncovering a rusted hatch bolted from the outside. It took 2 crowbars and a sledgehammer to break the seal. When the door finally swung open with a groan, the air that emerged was damp and stale, the kind that clings to old wood and sealed secrets. Jennings stepped forward, flashlight raised, then froze. "Oh my God," he said. "Everyone back, get the lights down here, now." Clara peered over his shoulder and saw what he had seen, a stairwell descending into darkness with a single boot print on the first step. A child's, and just beside it, scratched into the wall in faded red crayon, a name. The hatch beneath the warehouse groaned open, revealing a stairwell that descended into pitch-black silence. Detective Jennings led the way, flashlight beam trembling slightly as it sliced through the stagnant air. Clara followed closely behind, her breath tight, her pulse thudding in her ears. The concrete walls were narrow and damp, with streaks of rust from old pipes and smears of dirt that looked too deliberate to be natural. At the bottom they found a crude room carved from the earth, partially reinforced with plywood and scrap metal. On the far wall, beneath peeling insulation, was a mattress soiled with age, a stack of water bottles, and an old flashlight. But it was the writing that chilled them all. Dozens of crayon drawings, childlike, frantic, covered the walls. Some were of trees, a balloon, a house. Others were more abstracted, spirals, dark figures, faces with X's for eyes. In the center of the wall, scrawled in jagged red letters, was the phrase, "He said if I waited, Mom would come." Clara snapped photo after photo, documenting the evidence before forensic teams moved in. They recovered hair samples, a fingerprint on the flashlight's lens, and a small piece of fabric that matched Ivy's missing windbreaker. But there was no Ivy. No sign she had ever left the room, no exit beyond the hatch. Jennings ordered a full excavation of the area, suspecting a concealed tunnel or second chamber, while Clara returned to the sheriff's office to brief Hannah, who sat in stunned silence as the photos were shown to her. "Harold waited," Hannah said in a hoarse whisper, touching the screen where Ivy's name had been carved. "All this time, she thought I was coming." Meanwhile, Claire had finally obtained a court order to examine the original notarized transfer documents that had allowed Elliot to seize control of Skynova. A handwriting specialist reviewed the signature line and confirmed what Clara had long suspected. "The signature is inconsistent with David Greer's known samples," the expert stated. "Slight angle variation, pressure discrepancy, and stroke inconsistencies." This was forged. Clara presented the findings to Jennings, who coordinated with state prosecutors. Elliot Frayne was arrested at his vacation home in Aspen 2 days later, charged with fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection to David and Ivy Greer's disappearances. Under interrogation, Elliot held out for less than 48 hours. Jennings applied pressure using the photos from the basement, the GPS logs, and finally the forensic analysis of the forged signature. Elliot's facade cracked. "I never meant for it to happen like this," he said, head in hands, voice breaking not from remorse but from exposure. David was going to tank the company. He was pulling out of the defense contract, shutting down the patent filings. I told him it was suicide. He didn't listen to so you tampered with the balloon? Jennings asked. Elliot hesitated. I arranged for a system overrode, yes. I wanted him scared, not dead, just enough to make him listen. But I didn't think he'd crash. I didn't think... Helped you? Dean Carter, Elliot whispered. He handled the contingency, said he'd take care of cleanup if things went sideways. Define cleanup. Promised to intercept David post-landing, force him to sign the real transfer, use Ivy as leverage if needed. I thought it was just insurance. Where is Dean Carter now? I haven't spoken to him in years. He went underground after the handoff, said he was done, took a cut, and disappeared. With the confession recorded, Jennings ordered an immediate manhunt for Dean Carter, flagging all known aliases and Bordress watch lists. Clara, meanwhile, dug into Dean's background and discovered he had once worked as Skynova's logistics contractor, specializing in ground recovery for remote launches. He would have known the Highlands terrain intimately. She traced several shell companies connected to Dean through equipment rentals, discovering a payment trail that led to a property purchase outside Moab, Utah, secluded, off-grid, and surrounded by canyon. Surveillance teams were dispatched, but when they arrived, the compound was empty. Inside, however, they found photos of Ivy, of David, of the warehouse in Colorado. A journal entry dated 5 years prior read, "Still haven't sold the girl. Not ready. Elliot keeps pushing. Says she's leverage. But leverage for what? They already got the company." Back at the station, Elliot was confronted with the photo. His face paled. "He kept her? You didn't know?" "No, he told me she was gone, that she didn't make it." "And you believed him?" "I didn't ask," Elliot said quietly. "I didn't want to know." Clara stood outside the interview room, hands clenched into fists, as she watched the man who had dismantled her cousin's life hide behind half-truths and cowardice. But now they had a name, a face, a trail. And somewhere out there, Ivy might still be waiting. Dean Carter didn't surface for nearly 6 weeks after the manhunt began. His face appeared on every regional news bulletin, his vehicle descriptions blasted across interagency networks, but he remained a ghost. No credit card activity, no phone signal, no surveillance hits. Clara grew more restless with each day, haunted by the images from the bunker, the twisted crayon drawings. The child, Hannah, hardly slept, often seen pacing her backyard in the early morning hours, clutching Ivy's childhood hoodie like a talisman. The break came unexpectedly from a motel clerk in Carson City, Nevada, who recognized Dean's photo when the local sheriff's office circulated it with an updated beard and hair length approximation. He had checked in under the alias Tom Rivers, paid cash, and kept mostly to himself, except for frequent trips to and from a black Jeep Cherokee parked out back. A coordinated team moved in before dawn, surrounding the perimeter in silence. Dean was caught attempting to flee through a side exit, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a small black hard case clutched tightly in his hands. He didn't resist arrest, but he didn't speak either. His eyes were vacant, his expression unreadable. Clara and Detective Jennings were informed within the hour. By midday, they were at the evidence facility in Reno, where Dean's belongings were cataloged and laid out across 2 long tables. Among the contents were burner phones, a stack of IDs with varying names and states, $14,000, 0 cents in mixed currency, and the hard case, which contained a compact digital video camera, dusty but intact. Jennings looked at Clara. "If this has anything on it, we'll need chain of custody documentation before we view." Clara nodded, but her throat was tight with dread. What could be inside that Dean needed to carry after all these years? An FBI technician extracted the data, creating a forensic image before opening any files. The video folder contained 12 clips, all time-stamped between June 10th and June 13th, 2013. The first few were uneventful, wide shots of the balloon launch site, overhead drone footage, and what appeared to be GPS overlay. But clip number 5 changed everything. It began with static, then focused sharply on a forest clearing, clearly taken with a handheld camera from a distance. Through the trees, 2 figures could be seen, David, stumbling and bloodied, his face swollen, shirt torn, one arm hanging limp, and Dean, holding what looked like a steel baton. David said something inaudible, and Dean struck him hard across the back, sending him to the ground. "Where's Ivy?" David gasped, barely lifting his head. "She's safe," Dean replied, "for now. But you're going to sign the papers when they bring them, or she goes where you won't find her." The screen blurred momentarily as the camera adjusted focus. David coughed violently, then rolled onto his side. "She's a child. You don't—" Another strike, this time off camera. Dean's boots appeared in the corner, pacing. "She's leverage. Nothing more. Elliot just wants what's his." The feed cut out and resumed in another clip, this time from inside a vehicle. Ivy, her hands bound, her face bruised, sat silently in the back seat, eyes vacant. A man's voice, likely Dean's, told her, "Be quiet, and no one gets hurt." A blanket was pulled over her head, and then the doors slammed shut. The final video showed the vehicle parked near what looked like a ravine. The trunk opened briefly, revealing Ivy still tied, then darkness. Jennings ended the playback, his jaw tight. Clara turned away, barely holding back a sob. Hannah, informed later that evening, collapsed to the floor when she heard her daughter's muffled cries in the footage. Medical personnel were called in to stabilize her, while Claire remained behind, hands gripping the edge of the table, willing herself not to break. Dean refused to talk, even when shown the footage, even when confronted with the evidence that could put him behind bars for the rest of his life. He sat silently in his cell, arms crossed, gaze fixed on a point beyond anyone's comprehension. But his camera, his carelessness, had already told them enough. Ivy had survived the crash. She had been kidnapped, abused, and hidden, and someone, perhaps even now, might still be holding her. The footage timestamps matched the final pings from the GPS beacon on Ivy's bag. Jennings ordered a re-sweep of the surrounding areas near the ravine in the video, dispatching drones and ground units to cross regularly streaming bags with a facial records license and a geological formations to trail formula and detected thermal irregularities beneath the forest canopy. Infrared suggested underground structures, perhaps more than one. The footage reignited national coverage, media vans parked outside the sheriff's department. Pressure mounted on law enforcement to act swiftly. Clara sat in a briefing room the night before the raid, watching the video of Ivy on loop. Her breathing shallow, her fingers clenching tighter with each repetition of that haunting image. Her cousin, scared and alone, waiting for a rescue that never came. Until now, the thermal drone scans led them to a secluded property tucked into the edge of Carson Ridge, a swath of highland terrain marked by rocky pastures, overgrown fencing, and a rotting barn that sat half-cocked under a slanted sky. The land had been deeded to a shell corporation with ties to Dean Carter, though no formal activity had been recorded since 2017. To the naked eye, the place looked abandoned, but the Heek signatures suggested otherwise. A team of federal agents, along with Jennings and a tactical rescue unit, arrived just before dawn. Clara watched from the mobile operations van, heart racing as surveillance feeds showed officers surrounding the main house, weapons raised, night vision lenses glowing in the dim light. A single figure exited the barn early, an older man with graying stubble clutching a lantern. He was quickly detained without resistance, mumbling incoherently about feeding animals that hadn't lived there in years. Jennings gave the order to breach the barn. The tactical unit approached cautiously, stepping over warped boards and rusted tools, their lights sweeping across hay bales and cracked feeders. Then one of them paused. "Sir, we've got something here," came the voice through the comms. Beneath the hay, near the eastern stall, was a trap door, metal, heavy, with industrial hinges. A generator cable snaked from underneath and disappeared into the wall. With a coordinated count, they pried the hatch open. A gust of warm, stale air surged upward, thick with the scent of darkness, carved into concrete, lined with frayed insulation. Jennings followed closely behind the lead officers as they descended, weapons drawn, light beams dancing over rough walls until they reached a steel door, bolted from the outside. The lock was rusted but intact. With a crowbar and brute force they wrenched it free. The door groaned open. What they saw inside silenced the entire unit. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly glow over the small room. It was cold, bare, with a cot in one corner, a desk against the wall, and shelves lined with food cans and medical supplies. On the floor, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, curled up in a fetal position, was a young woman. She didn't move at first, didn't speak. Her hair was long, matted, her skin pale and thin, eyes wide with panic as she blinked against the sudden light. One of the agents knelt slowly, whispering, "It's okay. You're safe now. We're here to help." Her eyes flicked toward him, then to the others. She opened her mouth, and a hoarse sound escaped, barely a whisper. "Don't hurt me." Jennings stepped forward, lowering his weapon. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Ivy. Ivy Greer." Clara's hand clamped over her mouth as the words echoed through the radio feed. Hannah, standing beside her, dropped to her knees, tears pouring down her cheeks. Ivy was alive, weak, terrified, trembling, but alive. Paramedics rushed in, wrapping her in a thermal blanket, administering fluids, gently coaxing her to sit up. She winced at the light, flinched at every noise, but allowed herself to be guided up the stairs. When they emerged into the open air, she blinked against the sunrise, her legs buckling after just a few steps. Hannah broke through the police line and ran to her, arms outstretched, voice cracking as she called her name. Ivy paused, then stared at the approaching woman. Recognition bloomed slowly, like a spark in a dark room. "Mom?" she whispered. Hannah didn't wait. She threw her arms around her daughter, pulling her in, clutching her as though to erase the years apart. Ivy collapsed into her, sobbing against her shoulder, her voice muffled. "I thought you were dead. He said you gave me away." Hannah whispered fiercely, holding her tight. "I never stopped looking." Paramedics guided them to the ambulance, where Ivy was examined more thoroughly. She was 24 now, but her body bore the signs of severe malnutrition, prolonged confinement, and psychological trauma. Still she spoke, slow at first, with long pauses, but the words came. "He said if I stayed quiet you'd come," she told the nurse. "Every time I cried, he said it made you wait longer." Her account, though fragmented, corroborated everything Clara and Jennings had discovered. Dean had moved her here shortly after the incident, using the bunker under the barn as a long-term holding cell. Ivy described a routine of control, limited food, forced silence, nightly terms off, and a strict set of rules. There had been times she tried to escape, once through a pipe near the vent shaft, but every attempt was punished. Once she broke a window in the upper shed. The next day, Dean sealed it with iron plates. "I counted the days for a while," Ethan said quietly. "Then I lost track." The rescue team recovered numerous items from the bunker, journals, surveillance logs, and a series of Polaroid photographs taken over the years, proof that Dean had been documenting her confinement, perhaps for leverage, perhaps for darker reasons. Clara stood near the barn long after the ambulance had departed, her mind replaying Ivy's voice again and again. She turned to Jennings. "What now?" "We take everything," he replied. "Every nail, every file, every fingerprint. This place is no longer hidden. It's evidence. And Dean, he'll never see daylight again." As the forensic team began dismantling the interior of the barn, Clara wandered toward a separate shed nearby, her curiosity pulling her toward a sliver of light visible beneath the doorframe. She opened it slowly. Inside were boxes, neatly stacked, labeled by year. 2013, 2014, 2015, one was partially open, children's books, even letters Ivy had written to herself, stashed and forgotten. On top sat a folded page labeled, "If someone finds this." Claire reached for it. It took 6 weeks for the final DNA analysis to return, and when it did, the envelope arrived with a seal from the State Forensic Laboratory, hand-delivered to Detective Jennings' office in a thick file marked "Confidential." Clara sat across from him, Hannah beside her, Ivy nearby in a chair wrapped in a soft gray blanket, her frame still frail, but her eyes clearer now, more present. Jennings opened the folder slowly, careful not to rush the moment. "The remains recovered near the crash zone," he said quietly, "are confirmed to be David Greer. The analysis is conclusive. Dental records, microchirurgical DNA, skeletal trauma. It's him." Hannah closed her eyes, one hand going instinctively to her chest. Ivy looked down at her lap, whispering, "He protected me." Jennings nodded. "The report says he sustained multiple fractures from the impact, rib, spine, one femur, but based on the position of the body and the makeshift shelter found nearby, he was alive for at least several hours after the crash. The analysis suggests he used his own body to shield Ivy from the fall." Claire reached over, placing a hand on Hannah's shoulder. "He bought her time," she murmured. "Gave everything so she could survive." They held a memorial 3 days later on a quiet hillside overlooking Ridgepoint Crest, not far from where Ivy had once pointed to the lake in the distance. A modest wooden marker, carved with the words, "David Greer, Father, Innovator, Protector," was placed beneath the tree where the first piece of balloon fabric had been found. Ivy placed a single white flower at its base, her fingers brushing the bark as she whispered goodbye. Meanwhile, the case against Elliot Frayne and Dean Carter moved swiftly through the courts. Prosecutors, bolstered by Clara's collected evidence, the digital footage, the false documents, and Dean's own disturbing journals, charged both men with conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated kidnapping, unlawful confinement, evidence tampering, and commercial fraud. Elliot attempted a plea bargain, claiming he had been manipulated, that he never intended real harm, but the paper trail, the emails, the forged signature, the financial gains from the international tech deal proved otherwise. The jury took less than 2 days to deliberate. Both Elliot and Dean were found guilty on all major charges. Elliot was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole, his final appeal rejected after a scathing statement from Ivy describing the years she had lost. Dean received 2 life sentences plus 40 years, his actions deemed systematic, predatory, and irredeemable. In the courtroom, Ivy stood with her mother as the verdicts were read, her voice trembling but unwavering as she faced the 2 men who had taken her childhood, her father, and a decade of freedom. "You thought I'd be forgotten," she said, eyes locked on Elliot. "You thought you buried the truth, but I survived. I remember, and now everyone knows what you did." After the trial, Hannah and Ivy moved into a quiet neighborhood just outside Fort Collins, far enough from the past to breathe, but close enough to the Highlands that they could visit David's memorial when they needed to. Ivy began therapy with a specialist in long-term trauma survivors, her sessions steady but difficult. Some nights were harder than others. She still startled at sudden noises. She still flinched when someone reached too quickly. But she smiled more now, especially when Hannah made breakfast, the way she remembered, because 4 is too many and 2's not enough. Clara stayed close, visiting often, joining them for movie nights or hiking trips that started with careful planning and ended with unexpected laughter. The family, broken and scattered for so long, had found its way back to something resembling wholeness. Ivy began sketching again, this time not crayon lines in the dark, but soft pencil on crisp white paper, drawing designs for weather balloons and climate sensors. When asked what she wanted to do next, she replied softly, "Something that lifts people up." On the first anniversary of the rescue, Ivy launched a small white balloon from Ridgepoint Crest. Attached to it was a note, "To the sky that took him and the wind that brought me back." As it rose, wobbling gently against the breeze, Clara, Hannah, and Ivy watched in silence. A family reborn from tragedy, finally free under the open sky. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more real-life inspired mysteries just like this. I'm curious, what detail shocked you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.